Yeah, there's a cast available for you. You didn't find them because I put them...
In 1986, a chilling revelation sent shockwaves through the FBI's Soviet counterintelligence section in Washington. Two prized Soviet informants, Valery Martynov and Sergei Motorin, had been compromised. Once exposed, the men were lured back to Moscow and brutally executed. A bullet in the head for each, the KGB's grim signature for traitors. The loss of the two agents, referred to affectionately within the FBI as M&M, marked an abrupt end to what had become routine covert meetings and intelligence exchanges. Parallel to this, the CIA, ensconced across the Potomac and Langley, grappled with its own nightmare. Over the years, dozens of their operatives in the Soviet Union had suddenly gone dark, were executed or imprisoned. The FBI scrambled to form an elite investigative team to unravel the mystery. Yet, as the years wore on and the puzzle remained unsolved, the unsettling possibility of the traitor being one of their own lingered in the air like a bad smell. Determined to root out the mole, experienced analysts within the FBI's Soviet unit delved into archives of debriefings and reports, searching for a pattern, a clue, anything that might reveal a link to the betrayer. They honed in on an innocent agent. Meanwhile, the culprit, who was outwardly a devout Catholic, a loving husband and father of 6, and a trusted FBI agent, harbored a perilous secret. Robert Philip Hansen's decades-long path of treachery is considered the worst intelligence disaster in FBI history. This is his story. Thank you all for clicking on this video. I want to extend special thanks to all my viewers, dedicated subscribers, and the incredible members and supporters over on my Buy Me a Coffee page. Your support motivates me to keep bringing you these spy stories. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to help me grow the channel. Life began for Robert Hansen on the 18th of April 1944 in a Chicago suburb near O'Hare Airport. Robert was born to Howard and Vivian Hansen. They were quintessentially an American family, working class, Christian, and by all appearances, very respectable. Howard had served in the Navy during World War II and went on to be a career police officer for the Chicago Police Department. His mother, as was so common for the era, was a housewife. Howard Hansen was a stern disciplinarian and frequently imposed harsh punishments on his young son. Robert recounted being rolled up in an old Navy mattress, trapped and frightened, or being spun around until he became sick. Punishments ostensibly aimed at toughening him up. Howard was not only strict but also emotionally distant. He belittled Robert, which left a deep mark on his psyche. Despite Howard's harsh treatment, Robert grew up with a complicated desire for his father's approval and guidance. Robert was an only child and attended public schools. While at William Howard Taft High School, he befriended Jack Hoschauer, who would remain his closest friend for the rest of his life. The pair graduated together in 1962 and spent their spare time racing their parents' cars around the neighborhood and dreaming of becoming Formula One drivers. After high school, Robert enrolled at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. He majored in chemistry and, in an ironic foreshadowing, also took Russian language classes. Howard wanted his son to become a doctor, wanting more for Robert than just being a cop. Robert worked at the State Psychiatric Hospital in Chicago during college summers as a recreational therapist, later convincing his friend Jack to join him there. It was here that Robert met Bernadette Walk. Known as Bonnie, she was a smart, beautiful young lady from a devout Roman Catholic family with close affiliations to Opus Dei, a conservative Catholic institution known for promoting the belief that everyone is called to holiness and that ordinary life is a path to sanctity. Bonnie was born and raised in Park Ridge, an upscale suburb of Chicago, in a home that valued education and religious commitment. The couple were dating when Robert graduated from college in 1966, and, pursuing his father's vocational desires for him, enrolled in Northwestern University's dental school. While studying dentistry, Robert Hansen acquired a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was called the Mortician, for always wearing a dark suit and tie, no matter the occasion. It was a sobriquet that suited not only his choice of attire, but also his personality and physical appearance. 6'3" and walking with a bit of a lurch, he seldom socialized with his classmates, choosing instead to have lunch with various women with whom he sought companionship. Robert dropped out of dental school 2 years later, feeling drawn to a career more closely related to law enforcement like his father. Bonnie and Robert had continued their relationship intermittently while Robert was studying dentistry and decided in 1968 to get married. Their wedding was almost called off when, mere weeks beforehand, Bonnie received a disturbing phone call from a woman claiming to be her fiancé's girlfriend. Robert admitted to having cheated on his bride-to-be, but the couple ultimately reconciled and chose to proceed with the wedding. Shortly after they were married, Robert converted to Catholicism. This was no mere superficial change. He became deeply involved in the faith, regularly attending Mass and becoming a dedicated member of Opus Dei. His devotion was such that he often encouraged his friends and colleagues to join him at church meetings. In the early years of their marriage, Bonnie taught at the local grade school and Robert enrolled to study part-time for an MBA. He also worked for Chicago PD like his father before him, albeit as an internal affairs investigator specializing in forensic accounting. Howard had mixed feelings about his son joining the force, but sent Robert his police-issued firearm in a gesture of goodwill. In the early 1970s, America was waging war in Vietnam, and Robert's best friend, Jack Hoschauer, went off to join the fight. They were thus for a time separated, but their interactions during this period and thereafter would later reveal a sinister, voyeuristic element to Robert's personality. After graduating with his MBA, Robert Hansen soon had his sights set on greater things. In the mid-1970s, he applied to join the FBI. On the 12th of January 1976, Robert Hansen became an FBI special agent. He swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. His first post as an FBI agent was to a satellite office in Gary, Indiana, where he specialized in white-collar crime investigation. He soon proved his skills as a forensic accountant and was in 1978 transferred to work in the FBI's New York office. Hansen, however, soon found his work to be boring, and he longed for something more exciting. His wish was granted when, in 1978, he was detailed to the Soviet counterintelligence division within the New York office. This division was involved in activities like surveillance, recruiting spies, and busting networks. His role here involved creating an automated national counterintelligence database for the FBI, leveraging his background in accounting and computer skills. This position gave him a comprehensive overview of the espionage landscape in New York, a hotbed for Soviet bloc espionage activities. He had access to the file room and spent hours poring over Soviet espionage cases, developing somewhat of a romanticized fascination for spying. Extremely conservative and anti-communist, almost to a level of cartoonishness, Robert Bob Hansen was climbing the bureaucratic ladder. However, beneath this veneer of professionalism and devout religious practice, Robert harbored secrets that would eventually not only shock his family, but also bring the FBI to its knees. When moving to New York, he relocated his family, consisting of his wife Bonnie and 3 children at the time, to Scarsdale, Westchester County. As a single-income household, the cost of living was high, and Robert began to feel burdened by his mortgage payments and the cost of sending his children to private Catholic schools. 5 months into his new assignment in New York, Robert Hansen decided to turn traitor. 2 blocks from Grand Central Terminal in New York City stood a 22-story building that housed the Amtorg Trading Corporation. This was a Soviet export agency and trade representation responsible for negotiating deals between the Soviet Union and American companies. This was at least its public persona. In reality, it served as a front for bringing in KGB and GRU spies. One day in 1979, Hansen walked through Amtorg's front door, took the elevator up to its offices, and delivered an anonymous letter to Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. While seeming quite brazen, Hansen's decision to volunteer his services to the Soviets was calculated. He knew that there was no surveillance of the front door to Amtorg, and that as such, his clandestine visit would remain a secret. In offering his services to the Soviets, Hansen said later that he hoped to make a little extra cash to supplement his inadequate federal salary, but intended to get out of the spy game quickly. This initial move into treachery, however, would mark the first of 3 distinct periods of Robert Hansen's life in which he spied for the Soviets, earning for himself hundreds of thousands of dollars and in the process betraying his colleagues, Soviet agents in place for the US, and his entire nation. The final years of the 1970s and the first half of the 1980s were a period of heightened tension and conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, a phase often referred to as the Second Cold War. This era was marked by a sharp increase in hostility and escalating tensions between the two superpowers. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 brought about the end of the détente, and the fighting of other proxy wars in Central America and Africa served to re-intensify geopolitical rivalries. This was the context in which Robert Hansen first found himself as a spy for Russia. During this first period of his espionage, it is believed Hansen received around $21,000 from the Russians, effectively doubling his annual FBI salary. The information he volunteered during this period included tipping off the GRU that the FBI had bugged a residential complex in New York popular among Soviet officials. His most damaging disclosure during this period was, however, when he revealed the identity of one of the US's most valuable informants, codenamed Top Hat. Dmitry Polyakov was a major general in the GRU who was recruited as a spy by the CIA in the mid-1960s. Polyakov was likely compromised also by CIA double agent Aldrich Ames, and was ultimately tried and executed by the Soviet Union in 1986 for crimes of espionage. It didn't take a crack team of investigators to bring an end to Hansen's first period as a Soviet spy. It was his wife, Bonnie, who discovered his treason. One night in 1980, Robert had retreated to his basement in secret to write a letter to his GRU handler. Bonnie ventured downstairs and, seeing him at work, confronted him about what he was up to. Given his history of infidelity, Bonnie had good reason to be distrustful of her husband. Robert denied an affair, but when Bonnie grabbed the letter and had a look at it, Robert admitted that he was selling information to the Russians. He said, however, that he was feeding them false information and thus doing no harm. This, of course, couldn't have been further from the truth. Bonnie remained uncomfortable about what her husband was doing and implored him to stop. She suggested that they visit their priest for guidance. The priest's advice was that Hansen should immediately stop what he was doing and turn himself into the FBI. Perhaps after considering the repercussions for Robert Hansen if he did this, the priest advised that what Robert should do instead was cut off all contact with the Russians and agree never to do it again. He was also told to turn over his ill-gotten gains to Mother Teresa. There's no record of Hansen ever having paid the money to charity, but he did, at least for a time, break off contact with his Russian handler. Towards the end of 1980, thus ended Robert Hansen's first period as a spy for Russia. For the next 5 years, Bob Hansen's life seemed to return to a semblance of normality, devoid of any high treason and clandestine correspondence. He had been promoted to supervisor in the FBI, and he was finally getting on top of the mortgage that weighed so heavily on his finances. Yet it was during this period in 1985 that Hansen chose to re-establish contact with the Russians. While money probably was a factor in his decision, it is believed that his low self-esteem also played a role. He had a desire for recognition that his position at the FBI was not providing. He considered himself the smartest man in any room he walked into and was frustrated to see others being promoted ahead of him. His fascination with all things espionage also continued to grow, with Robert even carrying with him a Walther PPK pistol, the same model famously used by James Bond. Bob Hansen re-established contact with the Russians by writing a letter to a low-level KGB officer living in Northern Virginia, whom he knew was not being surveilled. Inside this letter was another addressed to KGB spy master Viktor Cherkashin, stationed at the Soviet embassy in Washington. To establish his worth as a spy and to prove his bona fides, Robert revealed in this letter the names of 3 Russian men who had been recruited as informants by US intelligence. These men were Boris Usin, Sergei Motorin, and Valery Martynov. In exchange for all the information he had provided, Hansen requested payment of $100,000 and set out a plan for his long-term espionage relationship between him and the KGB. This included for further payments in diamonds rather than cash, and for his eventual exfiltration to Russia. As before, Robert remained anonymous. The KGB wouldn't learn of Hansen's true identity until many years later, knowing him only by the false names he chose for himself, the most frequent of which was Raymond Garcia. Hansen's spycraft was meticulous, providing detailed instructions to the KGB as to how they would communicate with each other and execute dead-drop exchanges. He implemented a system of signals using white adhesive tape in specific locations for the spy and his handler to know when packages had been loaded in their hiding spots. His spycraft, however, sometimes crossed over from meticulous to convoluted, with the result that in 1986 a package was left for Hansen by his KGB under the wrong corner of a bridge in a park and could not be located by Hansen. These missteps notwithstanding, it is estimated that during his second period of spying, Robert Hansen handed over more than 6,000 pages of classified materials and 26 CDs to the KGB, earning him as much as $500,000. As a result of Hansen's betrayal, Boris Yuzhin, a KGB officer assigned to the Soviet consulate in San Francisco, was sent to a Siberian prison where he remained for 5 years until the fall of the Soviet Union. Motorin and Martynov, or M&M as they were known to the FBI, were both recalled to Moscow, put on trial, and ultimately executed. Over and above the human cost, Hansen also compromised top-secret US intelligence operations, resulting in millions of wasted dollars and virtually crippling US national security. A key operation exposed by Hansen to the KGB was called VIDS, or Vehicle Identification System. Long before tracking technology was available to the public, the FBI had invented a small tracking device that could be attached to vehicles. This was meant to weed out Russian intelligence officers, but was rendered useless by Hansen. Another FBI effort ruined by Hansen was Operation Monopoly. This was a brazen plan starting in 1977 to dig a tunnel underneath the Soviet diplomatic compound in Washington to install listening devices. The operation was costly and complicated, the building works being conducted under the cover of darkness and in secret. The operation was, however, poorly planned and badly executed, producing not a scrap of valuable intelligence for the FBI. To top it all, it was later discovered that the tunnel had been compromised by Hansen during its construction and was thus doomed to fail from the very beginning. Finally, and most crucially, Robert Hansen compromised one of the most top-secret operations he was privy to, the Continuity of Government Plan. This initiative, first instituted during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953, was designed to ensure the ability of the US government to continue to function in the event of nuclear war. This included the relocation of the US president and other key figures in government to secret locations scattered across the country. Bob Hansen thus delivered into the hands of the Soviets the winning ticket should the Cold War have ever turned hot. For 6 years, Robert Hansen continued selling secrets to the Soviets in exchange for large sums of cash and diamonds. It was not only in his professional life that Hansen was duplicitous. His personal and family life was also merely a charade. When Bob and Bonnie were in the first few years of their marriage, Robert's friend Jack Hirschauer had gone off to fight in Vietnam. One day, Jack received a letter from his friend Bob. Inside, Jack was shocked to find a series of nude photos of Bonnie. Jack wrote to his friend to say that he must have sent him the photos by mistake. Bob Hansen simply replied to say that he hoped Jack enjoyed the little morale booster he had sent him. This was the first in a series of acts by Robert Hansen in which he would reveal himself to be a voyeur and an exhibitionist. After Jack had returned from Vietnam, he was visiting Bob at the Hansen family home in Virginia. Bonnie Hansen was in the shower. Bob Hansen invited his friend Jack to watch his wife naked in the bathroom. Despite the peer pressure, Jack on that occasion refused. It was not long after that Robert Hansen started inviting Jack to watch him be intimate with his wife Bonnie. Eventually, Jack gave in and became an active participant, peeping through the bedroom window from the back deck of the Hansen family home. After it became too cold at night for Jack to watch from his hiding spot outside, Robert installed a hidden camera in his bedroom so that Jack could watch on a TV in another room. In the 1990s, Hansen also posted erotic stories about Bonnie online. Bizarrely, he posted these under his real name. This sort of behavior continued for years. All the while, Bonnie was unaware of the indignity she was being subjected to at the hands of her husband. In the late 1980s, Robert Hansen also began frequenting a local strip club called Joanna's 1819. In 1990, during one of his lunchtime visits, he met a dancer by the name of Priscilla Sue Gailey. Dancing under various stage names and known to regulars at the club as Hot Legs, Robert became infatuated with the dark-haired, blue-eyed young lady in her early 30s. He sent a $10 bill to her dressing room after her set. The pair soon met and began chatting, and Robert handed her his business card. He spun her the story of being at the club to catch spies. The second time they met, Hansen bought Priscilla a diamond and sapphire necklace, which she gratefully accepted. The relationship blossomed from there, with Robert becoming Priscilla's regular patron. He showered her with gifts and money, all courtesy of the KGB. He loaned her his BMW when she needed to practice for her driving test. Better yet, he bought her her very own champagne silver Mercedes-Benz, which was accompanied by an American Express card that she could use for motoring expenses. When Hansen was due to take a work trip to Hong Kong, he bought her a ticket and invited her to join him there, traveling separately, of course, to maintain appearances. During the trip, Hansen worked during the day while Priscilla went out on shopping sprees. They met up in the evenings for dinner and drinks at lavish bars and restaurants. Both Robert and Priscilla maintained that their relationship was platonic. Despite her many offers, including during the final evening of their stay in Hong Kong, they were never physically intimate. Be this as it may, there's no doubt that there was an emotional affair between the two. It is quite possible also that Hansen was grooming Priscilla to aid him in his spying activities, perhaps to use her as a cutout in later exchanges with the Russians. For about a year the relationship continued, until all of a sudden Hansen brought it to an abrupt end. In December 1991, following the radical reforms by Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and the breakaway of many of the socialist republics, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin and the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Robert Hansen went to ground during this period, not knowing what organization would emerge in the wake of the dismantling of the KGB and the GRU, and what the geopolitical landscape would look like in the immediate future. With the stroke of Gorbachev's pen, Hansen's money tap ran dry. It is quite remarkable that Bob Hansen managed to emerge from the 1980s unscathed. The mid-80s, in particular 1985 and 1986, saw a great many US double agents smoked out and arrested, whether it was John Walker of the US Navy, Larry Chin of the CIA, or Ronald Pelton of the NSA. US intelligence was rocked by scandal after scandal as each spy was arrested. If one thing was certain, US national security institutions had been thoroughly penetrated. The reasons that Hansen managed to remain undetected are varied. However, his meticulous tradecraft and anonymity helped to shield him from prying eyes. Notwithstanding the revelation of all these spies, the CIA continued to lose agents in place. They were convinced that there were more moles within the ranks of American intelligence. Even the most fastidious of spies are bound to slip up eventually, and this is precisely what happened in the case of Robert Hansen. His brother-in-law, Mark Walk, was also an FBI agent. Mark learned of 3 pieces of information which, when triangulated, began to rouse his suspicions. First, in 1990, while attending an FBI conference, he was told in confidence that there was a mole hunt on the go. Then he found out through his wife that Bonnie Hansen had revealed that she had found $5,000 in cash hidden in Robert's sock drawer. The third and final tidbit was a casual remark made by Robert about the possibility of retiring to live in Poland one day. That was rather odd, considering that Poland sat firmly behind the Iron Curtain. While there are conflicting versions of precisely what happened next, Mark Walk maintains that he disclosed all this information to his FBI supervisor. Whether or not this actually happened, no further actions were taken at that time. Hansen's career continued its upward trajectory, which by 1991 saw him promoted to FBI Unit Chief 2. Hansen, however, began acting erratically. He hacked into a superior's computer and then reported it, supposedly to demonstrate how IT security needed improving. Then he had an altercation with FBI agent Kimberly Lichtenberg, whom he pulled to the ground, severely injuring the tendons in her arm after she excused herself from a meeting and walked out of Hansen's office. While Lichtenberg was paid workers' compensation for her injuries, no meaningful disciplinary action was taken against Hansen. By July 1993, Hansen started to experience cash flow issues. He had not been working for the Soviets for 18 months and was even asking family members to borrow money. He decided, therefore, that it was time once again to sell his nation's secrets. What he didn't know was how to establish contact with the Russians. Part of the fallout from the end of the Soviet Union was the dismantling of the KGB. What emerged was the Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, and the Federal Security Service, the FSB. The GRU, however, which is the Russian Federation's Foreign Military Intelligence Agency, continued to exist. It was the GRU that Hansen contacted during his first period as a spy, and so he saw fit to rekindle the relationship. His approach this time was haphazard and risky in comparison to his prior cautious approaches. After identifying a GRU officer as his target, he brazenly approached him at a parking lot near to the officer's home. Hansen identified himself using his alias Raymond Garcia and attempted to hand over a package. The officer, having no idea who the man was, jumped into his car and sped away. He promptly reported the incident to his superiors. It was taken as a provocation and a protest was lodged with the US State Department. When the FBI was told that the person had described himself as a disaffected FBI agent, the Bureau undertook a cursory investigation which led nowhere. Whether it was that Hansen was spooked by the incident or simply didn't find another opportunity to make contact, he went dark for the next 6 years. In the mid-1990s, American intelligence agencies were still losing agents in droves and wasting millions of taxpayers' money on compromised clandestine operations. They all knew, notwithstanding the outing of a great many double agents, that they still had a leak. The FBI refused to look inwards, assuming always that the problem was in another organization. These institutionally ingrained blinkers would serve to cause more damage to the FBI than it could ever realize. While the hunt was on for another mole, the investigators focused almost solely on the CIA as the source of the leak. The investigation would eventually lead to the arrest and conviction of Eldrick Ames, a CIA agent working in its Directorate of Operations. Ames, an alcoholic whose second wife had expensive tastes, had turned to the KGB in 1985 to fund a lifestyle his federal salary never could have paid for. The information he leaked led to the death of at least 10 agents in place. His treachery in many ways ran parallel to that of Robert Hansen, and the two men compromised many of the same agents and operations. After Ames received a life sentence in 1994 and his wife Rosario Ames was also sentenced for aiding and abetting her husband, US intelligence thought it could breathe a sigh of relief. Yet, with Ames behind bars, there was still evidently a leak. After the full extent of the damage caused by Eldrick Ames had been assessed, it was determined that agents were still being lost who Ames knew nothing about, and so the spy hunt continued. Brian Kelly was a CIA officer whose life was upended by a grave and mistaken suspicion. Kelly was a loyal career CIA officer with an impeccable record. After Ames, the CIA and FBI were left desperate to root out any remaining moles. Kelly fell into the crosshairs after an illegal spy operating in Washington named Felix Bloch was tipped off to a CIA investigation into him. Brian Kelly had happened to meet with Bloch while both were in Paris. Analysts wrongly concluded that Kelly, who had knowledge of various other compromised operations and agents, was the man who gave the tip-off. For years, Brian Kelly lived under a cloud of suspicion. He was subjected to intense surveillance and in 1999 was made to sit through a series of grueling interrogations. He was suspended from his position at the CIA. His home life was disrupted, his career stalled, and his reputation tarnished. The toll on Kelly's personal and professional life was immense and unforgiving. The truth was, however, that Brian Kelly was innocent. The real mole, as it later turned out, was again Robert Hansen. Ironically, Brian Kelly lived in the same street as Hansen and attended the same church. While the CIA and FBI busied themselves chasing their tails, a former KGB officer's star was rising. Vladimir Putin's ascension to the Russian presidency in the year 2000 had far-reaching implications in the realm of global intelligence. Putin's leadership signaled a return to certain hardline policies and a renewed emphasis on restoring Russia's influence on the global stage. It was against this backdrop of shifting power dynamics that Robert Hansen decided it was time to bring his spying hiatus to an end. His first step was to search the FBI's automated case support system for any information that could be linked to him in any way, from his prior addresses, his real name and aliases, to dead drop locations he had used. He searched it all. Over the course of a year, he thoroughly searched the FBI database 9 times. After satisfying himself that nothing in the FBI computer systems could be linked back to him, he managed to deliver a letter to an officer of the SVR, the successor to the KGB. On the 6th of October 1999, Robert Hansen was welcomed back into the fold. Hansen's methods were characterized by the same meticulous attention to detail and cunning as before. He still utilized dead drops, marked by white adhesive tape, but this time in a new signal site on an electric utility pole within one of Washington's affluent neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the CIA and FBI, taking advantage of the fallout resulting from the implosion of the Soviet Union, undertook a massive program to recruit KGB agents that found themselves out of a job. Codenamed Bucklure by the FBI and Racketeer by the CIA, the agencies were prepared to offer as much as $1 million to potential ex-KGB officers to work for American intelligence. Alexander Sherbakov, codenamed Mr. Pym, was one such ex-KGB officer. After he lost his job, he took to selling Russian art. He was lured to New York in June of 2000 under the pretense of meeting with an American art dealer. In truth, this art dealer was Bill Stout, a former FBI agent brought out of retirement to aid in recruiting Mr. Pym. After the initial contact had been made, FBI agents Deborah Smith and Mike Rockford were tasked with recruiting Mr. Pym. After persistent efforts and semi-hostile encounters, they finally made a breakthrough when Sherbakov revealed that he had in his possession a collection of letters exchanged between the KGB and an anonymous American mole during the Cold War. He had taken the dossier with him when he left the KGB, anticipating that it may be of value to the right bidder. The FBI ultimately agreed with Sherbakov that he would return to Russia and arrange for delivery of the dossier to the FBI. In exchange, he would receive financial support and resettlement in the United States under an assumed identity. Eventually, the dossier arrived at FBI headquarters. One of the items contained in the package was wrapped in a black trash bag with a note stuck to it which read in Russian, "Do not open." Sherbakov had warned that it should not be opened because it may have contained fingerprints. The package was immediately sent for forensic testing, but it would be weeks until the results were returned. As it turned out, the package had been recovered from one of the drops made by the mole. In the meantime, FBI analysts eagerly translated the letters contained in the package into English. At this stage, Brian Kelly was still the prime suspect, but nothing in the letters pointed towards him. In fact, some of the dates for dead drops recorded in the letters also coincided with a period when Kelly was in Australia. Also included in the package was an audio cassette. The tape contained a recording of a telephone conversation between the American mole and his KGB handler. It was immediately obvious that the voice was not that of Brian Kelly. The investigators were stumped. As they pored over the letters once again, one of the FBI agents, Jim Milburn, began to notice something strange. One of the letters used a derogatory term for the Japanese, a phrase once popular during World War II. Another letter referenced Richard M. Daley, a former Chicago mayor. These things sounded weirdly familiar to Jim. It was then that he suddenly realized he knew exactly who the mole was, the very man he used to share a cubicle with in his early days at the FBI. Robert Philip Hansen. When the results from the fingerprint analysis were returned, the investigators' strong suspicions were finally confirmed. They were a match for FBI veteran Bob Hansen. When Hansen was finally revealed to the FBI as their mole in December 2000, he was working as the FBI's liaison to the State Department. He was nearing the mandatory retirement age of 57. As much as the FBI had gathered enough evidence to arrest Hansen, catching him in the act of espionage would have likely resulted in a guilty plea deal and a conviction without the need for a trial. The plan was to make Hansen an offer he couldn't refuse, and ultimately catch him red-handed. Neil Gallagher, FBI Deputy Director at the time, called Hansen into his office to make a proposal, which was for Hansen to return to the FBI headquarters to work as a computer security expert to consult on the FBI's IT security. He was told that his mandatory retirement age would be waived and that he would be promoted to the FBI's Senior Executive Service. The offer played to Hansen's ego. To him, it was at long last the recognition that he felt he had not received from his employer. He did, however, ask for time to consider the offer until after Christmas. This gave the FBI the time it needed to transfer the task force investigating Brian Kelly onto the Hansen case, which was codenamed Grey Day. Since Hansen had access to the FBI's computer information systems, the entire investigation had to be run on paper. Hansen was immediately placed under 24-hour surveillance, the FBI even going so far as to buy the house across the street from the Hansen home to set up a permanent watching post. His new office at FBI headquarters was created especially for him, with the room and adjoining areas wired floor to ceiling with hidden cameras and microphones. FBI Section Chief for Operations, Rich Garcia, was to be Hansen's new boss and was tasked with coordinating the construction and fit-out of the new office. A young recruit, 27-year-old Eric O'Neill, was brought into the fold to work as Hansen's assistant. He was a law student who, for the prior 5 years, had been a member of the FBI's Special Surveillance Group, which tailed high-value FBI targets. He also had expertise in computers, which aligned with his cover as Hansen's assistant. As part of his new role, Hansen was also granted a parking pass. In January 2001, it was discovered that he had downloaded and printed 7 classified documents and was storing these in the trunk of his car, which was secretly being searched every day by the FBI. Eric O'Neill also managed to search through Hansen's satchel one day, where he found an SD card containing a letter written by Hansen to the Russians. The evidence was starting to mount up, but the FBI needed more. The real target was Hansen's beloved Palm Pilot, a device that he carried around with him everywhere in his back pocket, and very proudly made known that not even the FBI could break the encryption of the device that he had personally coded. The problem was, Hansen never let the device out of his sight. The FBI planned a ruse which they hoped would separate Hansen from his handheld computer. Hansen's bosses decided to challenge him to a shooting contest in the FBI's underground gun range. With $20 thrown down on his desk, Hansen begrudgingly got up and went down to the basement. He was gone for an hour. While Hansen was preoccupied with the shooting contest downstairs, O'Neill had managed to retrieve the Palm Pilot, a stiffy disk and another SD card and hand it over to the FBI's tech team. They promptly managed to copy all the data, return the items to O'Neill, who raced back upstairs to his office area and returned everything to their rightful places. The information the FBI managed to obtain was revelatory, including a letter stating the date and time of Hansen's next planned dead drop with his Russian handler. It was time to prepare a sting and to catch Hansen in the act. The dead drop had been arranged for the afternoon of Sunday, the 18th of February 2001 in Foxstone Park, a suburban neighborhood in Vienna, Virginia. The specific site, codenamed Ellis, was near a footbridge leading from the main entrance to a jogging path. FBI Special Agents Deborah Smith and Steve Pluter were in charge of the operation that afternoon. Hanson's every movement was being tracked through surveillance and phone tapping. The FBI knew that Robert Hansen planned to give his best friend Jack Hoschauer a lift to Dulles Airport around 4 p.m. that Sunday. Thereafter, Robert's family expected him home for dinner. Hansen was tailed by the FBI's Special Surveillance Group to the airport. After dropping off his longtime friend, he made a sudden turnoff into the Pike 7 Plaza shopping center parking lot in Northern Virginia. There he was observed preparing the dead drop package in the boot of his silver Taurus by wrapping the 7 classified documents and a letter to his handlers in a black garbage bag. He got back in his car and proceeded to the drop site. The FBI watched from afar as Hansen parked his car at Foxstone Park, stuck white adhesive tape on a sign indicating to his handler that the drop had been placed, then proceeded to hide the package under the footbridge. Heavily armed SWAT teams hung back in the shadows, not sure whether Hansen, who boasted of his shooting ability and owned a large arsenal of weapons, would initiate a gunfight when confronted. As Hansen was walking back to his car, the order was given by Smith to arrest him. Immediately, 2 SUVs screeched to a halt and SWAT teams burst out of the vehicles. Hansen was apprehended within seconds and offered no resistance. It is traditionally reported that as he was being arrested, Hansen asked, "What took you so long?" Another account has it that as he was being cuffed, Hansen's remark was, "So this is how it goes." The irony was that Robert Hansen had planned for this to be his final exchange with the Russians. In his letter, he hinted that he knew he was under suspicion and that his current position at the FBI was a do-nothing job designed to keep him busy but away from anything classified. Hansen was quickly bundled into the waiting SUV, read his Miranda rights, and taken to a nearby FBI office. Meanwhile, his wife Bonnie was starting to worry, as she expected Robert home for dinner hours earlier. She left her home, bound for Dulles Airport, but was intercepted by FBI agents upon her arrival. She was taken back home by the FBI, where a search warrant was executed and the house turned upside down by agents searching for evidence. Bonnie was soon cleared of any wrongdoing or complicity in her husband's spying activities, but investigators were shocked to hear the story from Bonnie of how she discovered her husband writing a letter in secret so many years ago. It dawned on the investigators that Hansen likely started operating much earlier than they expected, as early as 1979. Before dawn the next morning, Hansen was transferred to the Orange County Jail. The FBI needed time to prepare for the media storm that was soon to be unleashed, and waited to see whether any Russian SVR agent would arrive to collect Hansen's drop. Nobody ever did. As relieved as the Bureau was to have finally caught their man, they knew accusations of incompetence, lax security, and sheer stupidity would be leveled against them. The news of Hansen's arrest finally broke on the following Tuesday, with FBI Director Louis Freer holding a press conference. Immediately, questions were raised. How indeed could it be that a man responsible for catching spies was himself a spy? Hansen was denied bail on the basis that he was a flight risk and had all his assets frozen. He chose Plato Kacharis as his defense lawyer, who had represented infamous CIA double agent Aldrich Ames just a few years earlier. Hansen's sudden arrest was an enormous shock to his wife Bonnie, teenage children, and his best friend Jack Hoschauer. Bonnie would painfully learn of her husband's relationship with Priscilla Sue Gailey through reports in the newspaper. Hansen's voyeurism also came to light, and Jack apologized to Bonnie for how he had wronged her. In the CBS podcast Agent of Betrayal, Jack came across as profoundly remorseful for what he did over so many years. Despite the revelations of her husband's double life, his betrayal and infidelity, Bonnie stuck with her husband. Robert and Bonnie remained married, with Bonnie committing her life to praying for his soul. Hansen's arrest finally served to exonerate CIA agent Brian Kelly. Although he was reinstated to his position in 2001, he died 10 years later of heart failure. His family believed firmly that the stress of the years-long accusations and investigation hastened his death. Robert Hanson's guilt was beyond a shadow of a doubt, and he knew his best bet was to negotiate a guilty plea bargain. While no spy had been executed since the Rosenbergs after the end of World War II in the United States, the death sentence wasn't out of the question given the nature and extent of Hanson's spying. Following a period of intense negotiation between Kacheris and lead prosecutor Randy Bellows, Hanson pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage, attempted espionage, and conspiracy. Under the plea agreement, Hanson was sentenced to life without parole, forfeited $1.4 million paid to him by the Russians, and agreed to a 6-month debriefing period with the FBI to tell all about his spying activities. In the wake of the scandal, the Commission for the Review of FBI Security Programs was established under the lead of William H. Webster. The purpose of the Webster Commission was to analyze and recommend improvements to the FBI's security programs. These were, of course, found to be deficient in terms of both security policy and practice, given the ease with which Hanson was able to carry on his activities undetected for so many years. A thorough psychological evaluation formed part of Hanson's debriefing. Psychiatrist Dr. David Charney, who was appointed by Hanson's defense team, spent over 100 hours over 2 years interviewing Hanson. The chief aim was to get inside the mind of a career spy to understand, firstly, whether he suffered from any psychological conditions, but perhaps more interestingly, to understand what drove him to become a spy. Of course, one of the motivations was money. Hanson had to put 6 kids through private Catholic school and had a mortgage to pay. He received approximately $600,000 from the Russians, either in cash or diamonds, with an additional $800,000 being paid into an escrow account in Russia for his retirement. Yet the secrets he traded were worth far more than what he received, so there must have been other driving factors. Dr. Charney highlighted a key aspect of Hanson's psyche, a deep-seated sense of inadequacy and perceived failure. These internal conflicts likely propelled him towards actions he thought would redefine his self-image. Robert's troubled relationship with his father was also opined to be fundamental to his psychological makeup. His experiences as a child, the cruel and unusual punishments, the constant denigration and belittling likely contributed to his eventual betrayal as a spy. Robert's deep-seated anger and feelings of inadequacy, bottled up for years, would occasionally erupt, and his espionage activities were seen as an outlet for these suppressed emotions. This resulted in Robert Hanson's overbearing ego. He consistently saw himself as the most intelligent individual in any given setting. When he couldn't control the situation, he resorted to violence, as was seen in the physical assault of one of his employees. Finally, Dr. Charney found that Hanson had developed a romanticized obsession with espionage. Although he worked in counterintelligence, Hanson's role as a forensic accountant and computer expert meant that he was desk-bound, and he never experienced operations in the field. The game he played with his Russian spy masters was possibly an outlet for his espionage fantasy. Hanson's mindset thus comprised an unhealthy cocktail of low self-esteem, an urge to prove his intellectual dominance, and a belief that he was beyond the reach of the law. The lack of effective deterrence within the FBI as an institution within its security systems made espionage a seemingly attainable and enticing path. The sheer contradiction that was Robert Hanson's public and private personas can hardly be ignored. He considered himself a loyal patriot, yet he sold out his nation to its biggest rival. He presented as a loyal husband, yet he exposed his wife to the indignity of a peeping Tom and pursued a relationship with another woman. The stark contrast between his public persona and his private indulgences could lead Dr. Charney to only one conclusion: that Robert Hanson was an expert in compartmentalization. Hanson served his sentence at the ADX Florence, a United States federal supermax prison where he spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. He lived in a concrete box and slept on a concrete bed. He was allowed 1 hour to exercise per day and spent most of the rest of his time reading books from the small selection in the prison library. He was housed among some of America's most notorious and dangerous violent criminals. Some may argue that this was a fate worse than death. The 2 decades he spent living like this behind bars took its toll on his health. Robert Philip Hansen was found unresponsive in his cell on the 5th of June 2023 and was soon pronounced dead. An autopsy revealed that he died of colon cancer. Upon the recommendation of the Webster Commission, the FBI implemented wholesale reforms to its security programs, including improved security education and awareness, enhancing the detection of improper computer usage, and proper compartmentalization of classified materials. Not once during his whole career was Hansen ever subjected to a polygraph test. While the efficacy of such tests are debatable, the top 500 managers in the organization are now required to submit to regular polygraph testing. Redmond's law says that it is an actuarial certainty that there is a spy in your organization. If this is anything to go by, notwithstanding these reforms and the lessons learned from the Robert Hansen story, there are many others across the world, currently undetected, selling secrets just like Robert Hansen.